In September of 1962, a man named Harlan Dubois loaded his wife, his 3 children, and everything they owned into a rusted Chevrolet truck and drove deep into the Nevada desert toward a town that no one had lived in for 11 years. And what he discovered beneath the cracked earth of Caldwell Flats shocked even the federal geologists who had spent decades documenting the most contaminated land in the American West. They wrote about it in private memos. They never published a word. What Harlan found was not gold, not silver, not the mineral deposits he had been quietly promised by a man in a gray suit outside a Reno land office, not as a treasure, not as a geological curiosity, but as something the soil had been quietly digesting for over a decade, something that had been buried not by nature, but by men with clearances and spreadsheets, and the absolute certainty that no family would ever be desperate enough to come back to Caldwell Flats. They were wrong about that last part. By the following March, Harlan's youngest daughter, 6-year-old Marin, had stopped speaking entirely. His wife Eleanor had begun drawing the same symbol on the inside walls of their kitchen, a circle with something like roots growing downward, over and over, in the hours before dawn. 2 of their nearest neighbors, the only other souls within 40 miles, were dead. And Caldwell Flats, which had once been nothing but silence and wind and the memory of a failed mining community, had become something far more disturbing, a place where the ground itself seemed to be confessing. Before we uncover the disturbing truth buried beneath Caldwell Flats, take 1 second right now, subscribe, hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one, and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story reaches, because trust me, by the end of this video, you're going to want to talk to someone about what you've just heard.
The autumn of 1962 in the Nevada high desert was the kind of season that felt less like a transition and more like a verdict. The summer heat did not fade so much as it retreated, pulling back slowly, leaving behind a landscape that looked scorched not by sun alone, but by something deeper, something geological and indifferent. The Basin Flats southeast of Winnemucca stretched for miles in every direction, without a single tree tall enough to cast a shadow worth standing in. The sage was gray-green and brittle, clicking softly against itself in the constant wind that came down off the Humboldt Range, like a long, slow exhale. The sky was enormous and pale, and offered no comfort. Caldwell Flats sat at the end of an unpaved county road that most Nevada maps had already stopped printing by 1958. The town, if you could still call it that, consisted of 14 structures in varying states of collapse. A main street of cracked hardpan ran between them, the old wooden storefronts leaning together like exhausted men holding each other upright. The windows were gone from most buildings, replaced by darkness and the occasional flutter of something that had nested inside. The old assay office still had its sign, though the letters had faded to ghost shapes. The church at the north end of the street had lost its roof entirely. Its pews were still inside, slowly turning silver in the open air, the hymn books bloated and dissolved by years of desert rain. The smell of the place was the first thing Eleanor Dubois mentioned to her sister in a letter she wrote 3 days after their arrival. She described it as mineral and faintly sweet, like rust and something organic beneath it, the way a wound smells before it becomes infected. She thought at first it was the alkali flats to the east. She would later understand it was something else entirely. The sound of Caldwell Flats was the sound of wind moving through hollow spaces, through broken door frames and collapsed chimneys, and the long abandoned mine shaft at the western edge of town, which had been sealed with a poured concrete cap sometime in the mid-1950s, and which hummed on certain nights with a low resonance that Harlan's son Thomas, age 9, would describe simply as the ground breathing. To understand how a family could end up in Caldwell Flats in 1962, you have to understand what the American West looked like to a man like Harlan Dubois at that particular moment in history. Harlan was 34 years old. He had worked 7 years at a copper processing plant outside Battle Mountain, and in those 7 years he had watched his wages stay almost perfectly still, while the cost of everything around him moved steadily upward. He was not a stupid man. He was not a reckless man. He was a man who had done everything correctly, and found that doing everything correctly had left him exactly where he started: renting, owing, waiting. The federal government's relationship with Nevada land in this era was one of the most unequal arrangements in American civilian life. The state was, in the eyes of Washington, simultaneously valuable and expendable, valuable for its mineral deposits, its remote geography, and its sparse population, which meant that things could be done there that could not be done in Ohio or Pennsylvania with consequence. Expendable because the people who lived there were few enough, and poor enough, and isolated enough, that their objections rarely reached anyone with the authority to act on them. The Atomic Energy Commission had been conducting above-ground nuclear tests at the Nevada test site since 1951. By 1962, they had detonated over 100 devices in the desert air, and the fallout had drifted east and north in plumes that the government tracked carefully in classified documents and mentioned not at all in public communications. But atomic testing was only one piece of the machinery operating in the Nevada desert. The other piece was the Atomic Energy Commission's network of waste management contracts, quiet arrangements made with private firms to handle the byproducts of weapons research, reactor testing, and radiological experiments that the government needed to make disappear without the inconvenience of congressional oversight. These contracts were awarded to men who asked few questions and owned land in remote places, like the abandoned mine territory surrounding Caldwell Flats, which had been purchased in 1951 for $11,000 by a company called Western Meridian Land Holdings, a company whose principals, as would later be discovered by a single determined journalist in 1979, were former employees of a classified AEC subcontractor based in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. What this meant in practical terms was that someone with authority and resources had decided that Caldwell Flats was far enough from everything that it could absorb what other places could not, and they had been right about that for 11 years.
In 1962, the word radiation meant something specific to most Americans. It meant Hiroshima. It meant the mushroom cloud. It meant something enormous and cinematic and foreign. It did not mean the soil beneath a farmhouse. It did not mean the water in a hand-dug well. It did not mean the fine, pale dust that settled on a child's hands when she played in the yard, or the faint metallic taste in the air on mornings after the wind had been blowing from the west. The vocabulary simply did not exist yet for most civilian Americans to describe what contaminated land actually meant for a body living on top of it, drinking from it, breathing it, eating the vegetables grown in it. What was normal in Caldwell Flats, what had been normal in dozens of remote communities across Nevada, Utah, and downwind Arizona, was a level of radiological exposure that the AEC's own internal documents classified, in their characteristically bloodless bureaucratic language, as acceptable population dose within parameters. What was normal was that the men who wrote those words lived in Washington, D.C., and had never visited the places they were writing about. What was normal was that the families who bore the exposure had no idea it was happening. What was unthinkable, what was the precise species of unthinkable that makes a story like this one possible, was the disposal, because the contamination around Caldwell Flats was not solely the result of atmospheric fallout drifting in from the test site to the south. It was the result of something more deliberate. Between 1953 and 1957, under contracts administered through Western Meridian Land Holdings, a series of burial operations had taken place at 3 sites within a 4-mile radius of Caldwell Flats' main street. These operations involved the transport of sealed drums, some steel, some lead-lined, containing radioactive waste materials from experimental reactor facilities, contaminated equipment, and, according to one document that would surface briefly during a 1981 Freedom of Information request before being reclassified, biological research byproducts of a nature that the document declined to specify further. The drums were buried at depth. The sites were marked on internal maps with numerical codes. No surface markers were placed. No local records were filed. The land was, after all, uninhabited. It would remain that way. The men who made this decision were not monsters in any theatrical sense. They were administrators. They had deadlines and budgets, and the absolute, unquestioned conviction that national security required difficult choices, and that difficult choices were best made quietly, in places no one was watching. His name was Clifford Orrin Vass, and if you searched the public records of Nevada in 1962, you would find almost nothing. A post office box in Carson City, a Nevada business registration for Western Meridian Land Holdings, listing him as registered agent, a 1958 property tax filing for 4,200 acres of Humboldt County scrubland. That was all. Clifford Vass had spent 30 years becoming the kind of man who does not appear in records,
and he had been remarkably successful at it. He was born in 1911 in a small town in eastern Kentucky coal country, the second of 4 sons of a mine supervisor named Gerald Vass, who beat his children with a methodical, almost administrative consistency that Clifford would later, in one of the very few personal conversations his subordinates ever reported, described as educational. Gerald Vass believed that softness was a communicable disease, and that his job as a father was to ensure his sons were inoculated against it early and repeatedly. Clifford was the one who learned the lesson most completely. By the time he was 12, his older brother had run away. By the time he was 15, his mother had stopped speaking at dinner. By the time he was 17, he had left Kentucky himself, not running but walking, methodically, with a cardboard suitcase, and a complete absence of sentiment that the neighbors who watched him go found somehow more unsettling than grief would have been. He was intelligent in the specific way that serves bureaucracies well. He understood systems, hierarchies, the precise location of accountability within an organization, and more importantly, the gaps where accountability did not reach. He served in the Army Corps of Engineers during World War II, where he demonstrated an exceptional capacity for logistics under pressure and an equally exceptional capacity for making problems disappear without creating paperwork. He was recruited by the AEC in 1948 by a man whose name appears in no document Clifford Vass ever signed. He was told that his work would be important. He was told that it would be invisible. He was told that invisibility was the point. The one event that completed Clifford Vass, that pushed him from a man who followed difficult orders to a man who sought them out, occurred in the winter of 1952, during the first burial operation at what would later be designated Site 7C, 2 miles southwest of Caldwell Flats. A worker on his team, a young man from Elko named Curtis Briggs, had grown distressed during the operation. He had begun asking questions about the drums, about the manifest, about why the manifest did not match the shipping documents from Oak Ridge. Clifford Vass had listened to Curtis Briggs's questions with complete patience, and then 3 days later had arranged for Curtis Briggs to be transferred to a facility in New Mexico, where, according to the records Clifford filed, he was reassigned to a different project. Curtis Briggs was never heard from by his family again. The moment Clifford Vass remembered most clearly about that episode was not the decision itself, it was the feeling afterward, the sense of the operation continuing cleanly, without friction, without loose edges. He described this feeling once, to no one who wrote it down, as the satisfaction of a well-sealed container. He had spent the following decade chasing that feeling. Caldwell Flats was its fullest expression. A ghost town, a sealed container. A problem that had been solved so thoroughly that it had ceased to exist. Until September of 1962, when a rusted Chevrolet truck turned off the county road, and a 6-year-old girl named Marin Dubois jumped out and ran barefoot across the cracked earth and began, with a child's uncomplicated joy, to dig her hands into the pale Nevada soil.
Harlan Dubois was the kind of man that photographs never quite captured correctly. In every image taken of him, and there were not many, because Harlan did not trust cameras in the way that men of his generation and geography sometimes did not trust anything that recorded without asking, he appeared smaller than he was in life. He stood 6 feet and 1 inch, with the particular build of someone who had done physical labor since adolescence, broad through the shoulders and narrow everywhere else, with hands that were permanently darkened at the knuckles from years of copper processing work, regardless of how thoroughly he scrubbed them. His most distinctive feature was his eyes, which were an unusual shade of pale green that his wife Eleanor called water-glass eyes, the color of a drinking glass filled with water held up to a window. They were eyes that noticed things. That was the detail people remembered about Harlan Dubois after everything that happened. Not his size, not his voice, not his name. His eyes, and the quality of attention behind them. He had grown up in Lander County, Nevada, the only child of a dry goods store owner who died of a stroke when Harlan was 11, and a mother who responded to widowhood by becoming profoundly, quietly practical, in a way that left no room for sentimentality of any kind. She did not remarry. She did not collapse. She sold the store, moved them into a smaller house, found work as a bookkeeper for a mining supply company, and raised Harlan with a curriculum of self-sufficiency so rigorous that by the time he was 14, he could fix a truck engine, dress a wound, calculate compound interest, and identify 12 edible desert plants by sight. What she did not teach him, what she possibly could not teach him because she did not have it herself, was how to ask for help, how to recognize the moment when a problem exceeded what one person could solve alone. This gap in his education would cost him enormously in Caldwell Flats. The wound in Harlan's life was not dramatic in its origin. It was the wound of slow erosion, the kind that does not announce itself and is therefore never properly mourned. He had married Eleanor Marsh in 1951, the year he started at the copper plant, full of the specific optimism of a man who believes that hard work is a reliable equation. Input effort, receive outcome.
For 7 years he had worked that equation and watched it fail to balance. The house he wanted to own kept moving further away. The raise he expected kept not arriving. The sense that he was building towards something kept thinning until it was nearly transparent. By 1962, what drove Harlan Dubois was not optimism, but its residue, a grim, determined momentum that looked like confidence from the outside and felt from the inside like running on a road that was slowly becoming sand. His hidden strength was his observational precision. Harlan noticed things that other people's minds categorized and discarded: the way a wooden structure had settled, the direction a crack propagated through concrete, the smell of soil changing as you moved across a piece of land. At the copper plant, he had twice identified equipment failures before the engineers did, simply by noticing sounds and smells that did not belong. He had never been credited for either observation. He had simply been told the problem had been found and returned to his station. His secret, the thing about Harlan Dubois it complicates any simple portrait of him as a victim, was that he had known Caldwell Flats was not a legitimate land opportunity before he signed the papers. Not known precisely, not known in the sense of having documentation or certainty, but known in the way that his water-glass eyes and his trained attention for things that did not fit had been quietly accumulating evidence during the 3 meetings he'd had with the man from the Reno land office. The price was wrong. The paperwork had gaps where previous ownership records should have been. The man in the gray suit had been too careful never to make any written promise about the mineral potential of the land, speaking instead in enthusiastic hypotheticals. Harlan had noticed all of this. He had chosen to proceed anyway, because the alternative was another year in a rented house watching his children grow up in rooms that did not belong to them. This choice, eyes open, moving forward into something he knew was wrong, was the moral fault line at the center of everything that followed. He had brought his family to Caldwell Flats not in pure innocence, but in the specific moral compromise of a desperate man, and he would spend the rest of his life understanding what that meant. Ruth Cannon arrived in Caldwell Flats 6 weeks after the Dubois family, in the 3rd week of October 1962, driving a sand-colored Ford pickup truck that was older than several of the buildings she passed on the way in. She was 41 years old, which made her 7 years older than Harlan, and she had the physical presence of someone who had spent decades outdoors in difficult conditions, weathered without being worn down. Her dark brown skin etched at the corners of the eyes and mouth with lines that suggested not age so much as accumulated attention, the kind of face that has looked carefully at a great many things. She was 5 feet 4 inches tall and moved with a deliberateness that people sometimes mistook for slowness until they watched her work, at which point the mistake became obvious. Her most distinctive feature was her hands. They were the hands of a scientist, long-fingered and precise, always slightly stained with something, ink or soil or both, and in constant subtle motion even when she was still, as though her fingers were separately and continuously thinking. Ruth DeSola-Tannen held a master's degree in geological chemistry from the University of Nevada, Reno, a credential she had obtained in 1947 after a protracted institutional battle she described in private correspondence as less like applying for an education and more like negotiating a hostage situation. She was one of 3 black women to have graduated from that program in its entire history at that point, and she had received her degree in a ceremony she did not attend because she had been told quietly and indirectly that her presence at the formal event would create complications. She had framed the degree anyway. It hung in her truck's sleeping compartment, which tells you something about Ruth Cannon that nothing else could tell you as efficiently. Her family background was rooted in the mining communities of Elko County, where her father, James Cannon, had worked as a mineral assayer for 30 years and was considered by the engineers who actually employed him to be one of the finest analytical minds in the region, a fact they expressed through the consistent use of his expertise and the consistent refusal to give him the title or salary that his expertise warranted. Ruth had grown up watching her father perform brilliance inside a cage of institutional limitation, and it had produced in her not bitterness, or not only bitterness, but a ferocious, almost scientific interest in the precise mechanisms of how power maintains itself, how institutions make themselves invisible, how the cage is built to look like the natural order of things. Her wound was specific and recent. In 1958, Ruth had been working as an independent geological consultant for a land assessment firm in Reno, when she had been contracted to survey a parcel of federal land in Nye County for potential commercial mineral development. During that survey, she had discovered soil samples with radiological signatures she did not recognize, readings that fell outside the parameters of natural background radiation in ways that were subtle, but to her trained analysis, unmistakable. She had filed her report. She had included her findings. 2 weeks later, she had received a phone call from a man who identified himself only as a federal land administration officer, who told her that her findings were the result of equipment miscalibration, and that her contract was terminated, and that she should consider carefully whether pursuing the matter further was consistent with her professional interests. She had understood perfectly what was being communicated. She had spent the 4 years since then quietly and methodically building a case that she could not yet prove, but could not stop assembling. Her secret, the moral complexity that made Ruth Cannon something other than a simple hero, was that she had known about Caldwell Flats' specific contamination history for 8 months before the Dubois family arrived there. Not known fully, not known in the way that would have allowed her to give names and quantities and burial coordinates, but known enough. Known that the Caldwell Flats area appeared in the margins of 2 classified disposal contractor documents she had obtained through an intermediary whose methods she had chosen not to examine too closely. She had been planning to go there herself to collect samples, to begin building the evidentiary foundation of what she hoped would eventually become an undeniable public record. She had not anticipated that someone would move there first. When she learned about the Dubois family, from a mention in a Winnemucca newspaper's real estate transactions column that she had been monitoring for exactly this kind of activity, she had experienced a moment of genuine moral paralysis that she would later describe, in the journal she kept in her glove compartment, as the worst 30 minutes of my professional life. She had known in those 30 minutes that she should call someone, the county health office, the family directly, someone. She had called no one. She had instead accelerated her timeline and driven to Caldwell Flats, telling herself that arriving with evidence was more valuable than arriving with a warning she could not yet substantiate. She had told herself this so many times during the drive, that by the time she turned onto the county road and saw the lights of the Dubois house in the desert darkness, she had almost stopped hearing how hollow it sounded. The moment Ruth Cannon and Harlan Dubois first understood that their goals aligned, occurred not through conversation but through a look. It happened on her 3rd day in Caldwell Flats, when Harlan watched Ruth take a soil sample from the base of the old mineshaft shop, and then watched her face as she looked at the reading on her field meter, watched the specific quality of stillness that came over her expression, the way a person looks when an instrument confirms something they were hoping was wrong. He had seen that expression before. He had seen it in the mirror, on the morning 3 weeks earlier when he had noticed that Marin's gums were bleeding, and that she had stopped eating, and that her hair, when Eleanor combed it, was coming away in the brush in quantities that did not belong to a healthy 6-year-old child. The two of them stood on either side of that soil sample for a long moment without speaking. Then Harlan said, quietly, "How long has this been here?" And Ruth said, "Long enough." And that was the beginning.
The first real conversation between Harlan Dubois and Ruth Cannon happened on the evening of her 3rd day in Caldwell Flats, inside the Dubois kitchen, at a table that Harlan had built himself from lumber salvaged from the collapsed mercantile 2 doors down. Eleanor had put coffee on and then taken the children to the back bedroom with a firmness that suggested she understood something significant was happening without being told what it was. The kitchen smelled of the mineral sweetness that Eleanor had described in her letter, stronger inside the house than outside, which Ruth noted mentally, and which told her something specific and deeply unwelcome about the ventilation patterns of the structure and the concentration of whatever was coming up through the foundation. Ruth had not intended to reveal anything at this first meeting. Her plan had been to establish a neighborly presence, collect more samples over the following week, and then approach Harlan with a carefully constructed presentation of evidence that left no room for dismissal or denial. That plan lasted approximately 4 minutes into the conversation, at which point Harlan set a piece of paper on the table between them and said nothing. It was a page torn from a notepad, covered in his handwriting, a list. Ruth looked at it and felt the specific chill of recognition. He had been documenting dates, observations, symptoms. Marin's hair loss beginning October 3rd. Thomas complaining of headaches every morning since October 7th. A dead jackrabbit found near the mineshaft cap on October 9th, its eyes clouded, no visible injury. Eleanor's nosebleed on October 11th, lasting 40 minutes. The pale dust that accumulated on the windowsills overnight. The way the well water tasted on certain mornings. His exact words were, "like sucking a copper penny." He had written it all down in the precise observational handwriting of a man who had spent years noting equipment anomalies on a factory floor, and the cumulative effect of reading it was like watching a diagnosis write itself in real time. Ruth looked up from the list. Harlan was watching her with his water-glass eyes and the expression of a man who has been waiting for someone to confirm something he already knows and is not sure he wants confirmed. She said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly." He said, "All right." She said,
Did you know something was wrong with this land before you came here?" The silence that followed was its own answer. She nodded once. He looked at the table. She said, "I am not here to judge that. I am here because I have been trying to prove what this land is for 4 years, and I cannot do it alone." He looked up then, and whatever he saw in her expression, the absence of contempt perhaps, or the presence of a matching guilt, caused something in his posture to change. He said, "Tell me what you know." She said, "You tell me what you know first." They looked at each other across the handmade table for a long moment, the mineral smell of the desert moving through the walls around them, and then both of them began talking at once. The trust between Harlan Dubois and Ruth Cannon did not build smoothly. It built the way structures build in earthquake country, in stages, with pauses, each new level tested before the next was attempted. The first test came on the 5th day after their initial conversation. Ruth had left her soil sample kit in the locked bed of her truck each night, which was standard practice, but on the morning of October 24th, she found the lock undamaged, but the tarp over her equipment shifted in a way that was subtle enough that most people would not have noticed it. Ruth was not most people. She said nothing to Harlan. Instead, that evening, she left a decoy notebook on her passenger seat, a composition book filled with meaningless geological notations she had fabricated specifically for this purpose, and positioned a single strand of her own hair across the door seam in a way that would break if the door was opened. The following morning, the hair was intact. She moved the genuine notebook from its hiding place beneath her spare tire, and felt for the first time something that was not quite relief but was adjacent to it. She hadn't been certain. Now she was. Harlan Dubois was many things, but he was not working for the other side. The second moment came 4 days later, when Ruth made a decision that she understood was dangerous. She had, in the locked metal box she kept beneath her truck's rear seat, photocopies of 3 documents, partial, incomplete, obtained through channels she would not specify even in her private journal, that referenced the Caldwell Flats area in the context of what the documents called Class 4 disposal operations. The documents did not use the word radioactive. They used the phrase thermally processed material with long-term environmental persistence, which was the bureaucratic equivalent of radioactive in the same way that a sealed room is the bureaucratic equivalent of a prison. Ruth spread the photocopies on Harlan's kitchen table on the evening of October 28th and watched his face as he read them. She watched the color change in his jaw. She watched his water-glass eyes move across the page, and then stop, and then go back and reread, the way eyes do when the brain refuses the first reading. When he finished, he sat very still for a long time. Then he said, "They knew." His voice was quiet and entirely flat, the voice of a man from whom something has just been surgically removed. Ruth said, "Yes." He said, "Before we came." She said, "Long before." He put both hands flat on the table and looked at them and said, "My daughter is 6 years old." Ruth said nothing because there was nothing to say that was already in the room with them. The third moment, the one that completed the structure between them, occurred on November 2nd, a cold night with a wind coming hard off the Humboldt Range that made the old buildings of Caldwell Flats creak and groan in a way that Thomas Dubois had begun calling the town talking. Ruth had been running a final set of field meter readings along the western perimeter of the property when her equipment led her to a location approximately 30 yards north of the mineshaft cap, a slight depression in the soil that she had noted earlier but not yet sampled. She was crouched over this depression, her meter in hand, when her flashlight caught a seam in the earth that should not have been there. A straight seam, not a geological feature. A cut. She was still staring at it when she heard footsteps behind her and spun around with her hand raised, and Harlan stopped 6 feet away with both hands open in the darkness and said, "Easy. I saw your light from the window." She exhaled and turned back to the seam and said, "Look at this." He crouched beside her. They both looked at it. He reached out and she caught his wrist before his fingers touched the soil and said, Don't ever touch the soil with bare hands." He pulled his hand back and looked at her, and she saw in his expression not offense but immediate, absolute comprehension. He said, "How bad is it?" She said, "Bad enough that your daughter needs to leave this property tomorrow." He said, "Where would she go?" Ruth said, "She can go to my sister in Winnemucca. Tonight if possible." Harlan looked at the straight seam in the earth for a long time, then stood up and said, "I'll tell Eleanor." And he walked back toward the house without another word, which was the moment Ruth understood that this man, whatever his original failures of judgment, was not going to be an obstacle.
It was Harlan who confessed first, and he did it on the night of November 4th, after Marin and the 2 older children had been driven to Winnemucca by Eleanor, who had agreed to this arrangement with a quietness that was more frightening than argument would have been. Harlan and Ruth sat at the kitchen table with a bottle of bourbon that Harlan produced from a cabinet and poured into 2 glasses without asking, and after a silence that lasted long enough for the wind to shift direction twice, he said, "I need to tell you something about how we ended up here." He told her about the man in the gray suit. He told her about the land office meetings, the gaps in the paperwork, the price that was wrong. And then he told her the part he had not told Eleanor, the part that had been sitting in his chest like a stone since before they had even loaded the truck in Battle Mountain. 3 weeks before the family moved to Caldwell Flats, Harlan had driven out to the property alone on a reconnaissance that Eleanor believed was to measure rooms and assess the structural condition of the buildings. That part was true, but there was another part. During that solo visit, he had found, in the crawlspace beneath the main house, a small collection of objects that the previous, or rather the last, occupants had left behind. Among those objects was a glass jar containing what appeared to be soil samples, each wrapped in paper and labeled in handwriting he did not recognize. The labels used numbers rather than words. He had not understood what the jars were, but beside them was something he had understood immediately, a child's shoe, small, perhaps a size 4. It was the only item in the crawlspace that suggested a family had ever actually lived in this house rather than worked in it, and something about the solitary shoe, one shoe, no mate, no other children's items. Just this single small shoe, in the dark beneath a house in a ghost town, had made the hair on his arms rise in a way he could not rationalize. He had left it where he found it. He had gone back to Battle Mountain, and he had loaded the truck anyway, because he had told himself it meant nothing, and because the alternative meant another year in a rented house, and because he had been very good, by 1962, at deciding what things meant nothing. Ruth listened to this without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "The shoe might still be there." Harlan said, "I know." She said, "It might tell us something." He said, "I know that too." There was another silence, and then Ruth said, "I have something to tell you as well." And she told him about the 8 months, about knowing, about the 30 worst minutes of her professional life in the cab of her truck outside a Winnemucca diner, choosing evidence over warning. When she finished, neither of them looked at the other for a while. The bourbon sat mostly untouched. Finally Harlan said, "So neither of us is the good person in this story." Ruth said, "No." He said, "Does that change what we need to do?" She looked at him then and said, "It means we have to do it better than good people would, because we owe it more." Drop a 44 in the comments right now if you're still with us. I need to know who's made it this far into Caldwell Flats, because what comes next is where this story stops being history and starts being something else entirely. What Harlan and Ruth needed, methodology. Harlan had the land access and the observational precision. Together, over the course of 3 evenings, they constructed a plan in 4 stages. The first stage was systematic soil and water sampling across all 3 suspected burial sites, using Ruth's equipment to establish a radiological map of the property that could be independently verified. Ruth would document everything using protocols derived from her graduate training: chain of custody, duplicate samples, GPS coordinates recorded in 2 separate notebooks kept in 2 separate locations. The second stage was the retrieval and documentation of whatever remained in the crawlspace, the jars, the shoe, anything else, which Harlan believed might constitute physical evidence of prior human habitation during or after the disposal operations. The third stage was the identification and location of Clifford Orrin Vass and Western Meridian landholdings through public and semi-public records, building a documented chain of responsibility that connected the buried materials to a specific person making specific decisions. The fourth stage, the one they discussed last and most carefully, was delivery, getting the documentation to someone who could not be reached by a phone call from a federal land administrator, a journalist, a senator's office, a university research department, someone outside the system that had built and maintained this particular silence. The seeds of doubt were planted quietly between them as they talked through the plan. The first, Ruth's sample equipment, while sensitive, was field grade rather than laboratory grade. The readings it produced were compelling but not legally definitive. A good lawyer, and Clifford Vass would have very good lawyers, could challenge the methodology. They needed a laboratory, which meant they needed to transport samples across state lines without the samples being intercepted, which meant they needed to understand whether anyone was watching Caldwell Flats. The second seed was quieter and more troubling: the child's shoe.
If there had been a family in Caldwell Flats after the disposal operations and before the Dubois family, if someone else had lived on this land and been exposed, then there might be a record of what had happened to them. And if there was a record, then somewhere in the machinery of Western Meridian Land Holdings and the AEC's contractor network, there was a person who had looked at that record and decided that Caldwell Flats was still an appropriate place to sell to a family with children. That person, Harlan said, was not Clifford Vass acting alone. Ruth agreed. They looked at each other across the table and understood simultaneously that the plan they had just built was the beginning of something, not the end. That what they would find when they started pulling on these threads would be heavier than either of them had yet imagined.
They began on the morning of November 6th, 1962, at first light, when the desert was still cold enough that their breath came out in small white clouds and the sage crackled with frost. Ruth had divided the property into a grid on a piece of graph paper the night before, 16 sectors arranged around the 3 suspected burial sites, and they worked through the first 4 sectors methodically and without conversation, Ruth operating the field meter while Harlan collected duplicate soil samples into the sealed glass vials she had brought from Reno in a foam-lined case that looked from the outside like a fishing tackle box. The readings in the first sector were elevated but not extreme, what Ruth described in her field notebook as consistent with secondary dispersal, meaning the contamination here was not directly above a burial site, but had migrated through groundwater or soil movement from something nearby. The second sector was higher. The third sector was significantly higher. The fourth sector, which sat directly adjacent to the concrete cap of the old mine shaft, produced a reading that caused Ruth to check her meter twice, then hold it very still and watch the number on the display with an expression that Harlan had learned, in 1 week of working beside her, to read as the expression she wore when she was deciding how to tell him something he was not going to want to hear. She did not tell him immediately. She wrote the number in her field notebook, circled it, and moved to the duplicate sample collection with a deliberateness that Harlan recognized as the professional equivalent of keeping your voice level. When both samples were sealed and labeled, she stood up and stretched her back and said, conversationally, as though commenting on the weather, "The mine shaft cap is not the primary site." He looked at her. She said, "The readings here are high because whatever is below us has been venting upward through the shaft for years, but the cap is not where the bulk material was buried." He said, "Then where?" She turned and pointed east, toward the main street of Caldwell Flats, toward the cluster of collapsed and leaning buildings, toward the church with its open roof and its silver pews. She said, "The readings drop off sharply in every direction except east." He followed her pointing finger with his water-glass eyes and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "It's under the town." She said, "Under part of it. At least one of the primary burial sites is beneath the structures on the east side of Main Street, possibly 2. He looked at the buildings for a long time. Then he said, "The house we're living in is on the west side." She said, "Yes." He exhaled slowly. She said, "That is not an accident." Harlan turned to look at her. She said, "Someone placed your family on the western parcel deliberately. The western parcel is the least contaminated quadrant of this property." He was quiet for a moment, working through the implication, and then he said, "They didn't expect us to dig. They expected us to stay on the surface, to live there without digging, without sampling, without looking." Ruth said, "Yes." And Harlan said, "Which means they've done this before." The frost crackled in the sage around them. Neither of them spoke again for a while. The thing that went wrong that morning was small enough that Harlan almost did not note it in the journal he had started keeping at Ruth's insistence. As they packed their equipment to move to the 5th sector, he noticed a vehicle on the county road, a dark green truck, moving slowly, too slowly for a through traveler, at a distance of perhaps half a mile. It turned around before reaching the Caldwell Flats access road and drove back the way it had come. Harlan wrote it down. Dark green truck, Nevada plates, partial number 4F, approximately 7:40 a.m., did not approach. He underlined it twice without knowing why, the way his body sometimes knew things before his mind caught up. The crawl space beneath the main house was accessed through a hatch in the kitchen floor that Harlan had covered with a rag rug when they moved in, and then after his conversation with Ruth, covered more deliberately with the kitchen table itself. On the evening of November 8th, they moved the table, lifted the hatch, and Harlan went down alone with a flashlight, while Ruth remained above, her field meter running, monitoring for any spike in readings that would mean the crawl space itself was a direct contamination source.
The glass jars were exactly where he had left them. He photographed each one in place before touching anything, using Ruth's camera, the flash illuminating the low dirt-walled space in white bursts that made the shadows jump. There were 7 jars in total, each containing soil samples wrapped in paper, each labeled with a number and a date. The dates ranged from March 1954 to August 1957. The handwriting was different on different jars, at least 3 distinct hands, Harlan noted, which means the sampling had been done by multiple people over multiple visits, which means this was not a single individual's private record, but something that had been coordinated, documented, continued across years. Someone had been monitoring this property from the inside, from beneath the house, regularly and carefully, for at least 3 years. Then he found what was beside the jars, and he stopped moving entirely. It was not just the child's shoe. He had remembered one shoe. There were 2 shoes now, both of them, a matched pair, placed together with the neatness that adults use when they set out children's things, toes pointing toward the wall. Beside the shoes was a small stack of folded papers, held together with a rubber band that had dried and cracked but not yet broken. And beside the papers, laid flat on the dirt, was a photograph. Harlan picked it up with the hand that was not holding the flashlight and held it close to the beam. It showed a family. A man, a woman, 2 children, both young, perhaps 4 and 7. They were standing in front of the main house. The house looked inhabited, curtains in the windows, a rocking chair on the porch, a child's tricycle on the hardpan. The photograph was not dated, but the clothing and the quality of the image suggested early to mid-1950s. The family was smiling. They were the easy, unguarded smiles of people who believe they are safe. Harlan stared at the photograph for a long time, and then he put it carefully in his shirt pocket and unfolded the papers. They were letters, 7 of them, handwritten, addressed to an office at the Nevada State Health Division in Carson City. They were from a man named Walter Pruitt, who identified himself in the first letter as residing at what he called the Caldwell property, having purchased the land access rights through a Carson City real estate agency in March of 1953. The letters were dated between June 1954 and August 1957. They described, in escalating urgency, a series of health symptoms affecting Walter Pruitt's family, his wife Margaret, his daughter Claire, his son Dennis. Fatigue, headaches, bleeding gums, hair loss. In the 4th letter, Walter Pruitt described his daughter Claire, who was 5 years old, as having developed sores on her arms that did not heal. In the 5th letter, he described his wife Margaret as having lost 40 pounds in 3 months and being unable to keep food down. In the 6th letter, written in a handwriting that had changed, shakier, less controlled, he said that Dennis was in a Winnemucca hospital and that the doctors could not explain his blood results. The 7th letter was different from the others. It was shorter. The handwriting was barely legible. It said only, "I know what this is now. I know what you put here. I am writing this so that someone will know. If we are gone when this is found, it was not illness. It was what is in the ground. Find the jars. Walter Pruitt, October 19th, 1955. Harlan came up out of the crawl space and set the letters and the photograph on the kitchen table, and Ruth read them standing up, without sitting down, without speaking. When she finished, she stood very still for a moment, and then she said, quietly and precisely, "They didn't just contaminate this land. They sold it to a second family, knowing it was contaminated, and then they monitored the effects. The glass jars were theirs, not Walter Pruitt's. Someone was coming to this house, to this crawl space, while a family was living above them, and taking soil samples to track dispersal rates, using the Pruitt family as a data point." Harlan said nothing. Ruth said, "That is not negligence. That is not a cover-up." He said, "I know what it is." She said, "There may be records. Medical records for the Pruitt family, hospital records from Winnebago, death certificates. If we can find those records and connect them to the dispersal contracts and the sampling jars, we have something that cannot be explained away as equipment miscalibration." Harlan looked at her and said, "You said maybe records." She said, "Yes." He said, "Meaning someone may have made sure there aren't." She didn't answer because the answer was already in the room.
The first death was Norman Teague, and it was shocking because it was not supposed to happen at all. Norman Teague was a field operative. The precise bureaucratic category mattered less than what he actually was, which was the man Clifford Vass sent to places where something needed to be observed and, if necessary, managed. He was the driver of the dark green truck. He had been making weekly passes on the county road since October, a standard monitoring protocol that Vass had initiated the moment the Dubois name appeared on the Caldwell Flats access deed. Norman Teague was 53 years old, a former Army MP who had worked for Vass since 1958, and who had, in that time, performed a range of tasks that he filed away in a mental compartment he never opened and refused to examine. He was not a complicated man. He was a man who had learned to be useful to people who needed things done quietly, and he had made a comfortable life from that particular skill. On the night of November 10th, Norman Teague did something outside his standard protocol. He turned on to the Caldwell Flats access road. He had observed, through binoculars during his morning pass, that the Dubois property showed evidence of systematic survey activity. The grid stakes Ruth had driven into the soil at sector boundaries were visible from the road at the right angle in the right light, and Norman Teague had the right eyes for that kind of detail. He had called Vass from a payphone in Winnemucca. Vass had told him to conduct a closer assessment. What this meant, in the operational language they shared, was to determine how much the people on the property knew and how far it had gone. Teague parked his truck a quarter-mile from the house and walked in on foot in the dark. He was competent and quiet, and he had done this kind of approach dozens of times. What he had not accounted for was Harlan Dubois, who had been sleeping badly since November 6th, and who had taken to sitting in the dark kitchen in the pre-dawn hours, at the table, with the letters and the photograph, and a stillness that Eleanor, had she been there, would have recognized as the stillness of a man rehearsing something. Harlan saw the shape of Teague moving across the hardpan through the kitchen window 40 seconds before Teague reached the porch. What happened in the next 4 minutes was never fully reconstructed because Harlan's account of it was the only account that existed, and Harlan's account was sparse to the point of abstraction. What Ruth found when she came out of the old assay office where she had been sleeping was Norman Teague lying in the hardpan beside the porch steps, not moving, and Harlan standing over him with his water-glass eyes doing the thing they did when they were processing something very large. Ruth checked Teague's pulse. She looked up at Harlan. She said, "What happened?" Harlan said he was going to the crawlspace. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "Is he alive?" Harlan said, "Yes." She stood up and said, "We have 2 days at most before someone comes looking for him." Harlan looked down at Norman Teague's still form and said, "We needed 2 more days anyway." The flatness in his voice frightened her more than the event itself. The second death was calculated, and the calculation belonged to Ruth. Norman Teague regained consciousness in the back room of the Dubois house on the morning of November 11th, and over the course of 3 hours of conversation that Ruth conducted alone, Harlan's presence, she had decided, would produce resistance where she needed cooperation. He told them, in pieces and with diminishing reluctance, about Clifford Vass and Western Meridian and the monitoring protocol. He told them about the Pruitt family. He said that the Pruitts had been relocated in late 1955. His word, relocated, used with a steadiness that meant something very specific. He said he did not know what had happened to them after relocation. Ruth watched his face when he said this and concluded that he did know, and that the knowledge was one of the things in the mental compartment he never opened. She wrote everything he said in her journal, verbatim, date and time-stamped. Then she told Harlan what Teague had said, and they made a decision together that neither of them reached easily. They could not let Norman Teague leave, not because they were willing to harm him further, that was not the decision, but because Ruth had recognized, during her 3 hours with him, a specific pattern of behavior she had encountered before in men who serve systems larger than themselves. He would, if released, report with complete accuracy and no omission, not because he was loyal to Vass in any emotional sense, but because reporting accuracy was what he did. It was the entire content of his professional identity, and the report he would make would end what Harlan and Ruth were doing before it could be completed. Ruth had spent the afternoon of November 11th preparing a second set of soil samples, not for the documentary record, but from the highest reading sector, the one directly adjacent to the mineshaft cap. She added them, dissolved in water, to the canteen she gave Norman Teague in the back room on the morning of November 12th. She told herself it was temporary incapacitation. She told herself the dose was not lethal. She wrote in her journal that night, in handwriting very different from her usual precision, "I do not know if I believe either of those things, but I know that Claire Pruitt was 5 years old, and Walter Pruitt wrote 7 letters, and no one came." Norman Teague died on the afternoon of November 13th. Ruth did not write anything in her journal that day. The third death was the one that neither of them planned, the one that arrived like a consequence completing itself, and it was the most disturbing thing that happened in Caldwell Flats, not because of its violence, but because of its specificity, because of the precise, almost editorial quality of how it unfolded, as though the story itself had decided what was necessary. Clifford Orrin Vass arrived in Caldwell Flats on the morning of November 14th. He did not send another operative. He came himself, which Ruth later said she should have anticipated, that a man who had spent 30 years ensuring his name appeared in no records would not trust the management of a situation this size to anyone else. He came in a black sedan with a Carson City rental plate, alone, and he walked toward the Dubois house with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who has never in his adult life been in a situation he did not control. He did not reach the house. He walked past the old assay office, and past the former barber shop, and past the collapsed mercantile, and then he stepped off the main street's hardpan and onto the ground between the mercantile and the church, the ground that Ruth's grid had designated Sector 9, the sector with the highest readings of any site on the eastern side of the property,
the sector directly above what Ruth's analysis had identified as the primary burial site, and he stopped. He stopped because his foot had gone through the surface crust of the soil. Not deeply, perhaps 3 inches, but 3 inches was enough for him to look down and see the color of what was beneath the crust, which was not the pale alkaline gray of Nevada desert soil, but a darker, damper material that had no business being at this depth in this geology. He crouched and looked at it, and his expression, which Harlan was watching from the window of the assay office, was the expression of a man who has maintained a very long silence and is suddenly hearing what the silence was covering. He was still crouched when the ground shifted. The surface crust of Sector 9, which Ruth's analysis had flagged as structurally compromised by decades of subsidence above the burial cavity, gave way in an area of approximately 4 square feet. It was not a dramatic collapse. It was quiet and almost gentle, the way exhausted things give way, a slow settling, a soft concession. Clifford Vass went into the earth to his thighs before the subsidence stopped. He was not injured. He was simply in the ground, held by it, the dark contaminated material packed around his legs with the patient indifference of soil that had been waiting for a very long time. He began to shout. Harlan came out of the assay office and walked toward him across the hardpan and stood 6 feet away and looked at him without speaking. Vass shouted for assistance. Harlan looked at him with his water-glass eyes. Vass said, "Get me out of this." Harlan crouched down to eye level, the way Vass himself had crouched a moment earlier, and said in a voice Ruth would later describe as the quietest he had ever heard him use, "Tell me where the Pruitts are." Clifford Vass looked at him for a long moment, and then, because he was a practical man who understood leverage, he began to talk. He talked for a long time. The Nevada desert was very quiet around them. By the time he finished talking, the morning had become afternoon, and Clifford Vass was very cold, and the contaminated soil was packed around him to the hip. He had told them everything. The Pruitts, the other sites, the names of the AEC contacts, the location of the documents. He had told them because he was a practical man, and because Harlan's eyes had convinced him that cooperation was his best option. He was still telling himself this when the second subsidence occurred, not the gentle kind, but the kind that happens when a buried cavity finally exceeds the structural tolerance of what is above it. The ground took Clifford Orrin Vass to the chest, then to the shoulders. The soil closed over him with the same quiet patience it had held for 11 years, and the main street of Caldwell Flats was still again, and the wind moved through the hollow buildings, and somewhere in the distance the mineshaft hummed its low resonance, and Harlan Dubois stood on the hardpan of Sector 9 and watched the surface of the ground settle flat as if nothing had ever been there. He stood there for a very long time. Then he went inside and washed his hands at the kitchen sink for longer than was necessary, the water running clear and cold and tasting faintly of copper pennies. And Ruth watched him from the doorway and said nothing.
On the morning of November 16th, 2 days after Clifford Vass disappeared into the ground of Sector 9, a vehicle turned onto the Caldwell Flats access road and did not turn back. It was a dark blue government sedan, Nevada plates, and it was followed by a second vehicle, a black Ford pickup with no plates at all. Ruth saw them from the roof of the assay office, where she had been taking compass readings, and she came down the ladder with a speed that told Harlan everything before she said a word. They had perhaps 4 minutes. The documentation, Ruth's field notebooks, the soil samples, the letters, the photograph, was in 2 separate locations as planned. One set in the foam case beneath Ruth's truck, one set in a sealed tin that Harlan had buried 3 days earlier in Sector 1, the lowest reading sector, the one place on the property that no one would choose to dig. The original documents from the crawlspace were in Ruth's locked metal box. The camera, with its exposed film, was around Ruth's neck. She pulled the camera strap over her head and handed it to Harlan and said, "Go to the crawlspace, now." He looked at her. She said, "They are coming for me. They do not know yet what you know. If they take me, you finish it." He said, "I am not leaving you here." She said, "Harlan." She said his name the way you say a name when you need someone to understand that the thing you are asking them to do is the only thing that matters. He took the camera. He looked at her. He went to the kitchen and lifted the hatch and went down into the dark beneath the house, pulling the hatch closed above him, and lay in the cold dirt of the crawlspace with the camera against his chest and Walter Pruitt's jars beside his head, and the sound of 2 vehicles pulling up outside above him, and the footsteps of men getting out, and a voice that he did not recognize saying, "Ruth Cannon, we need you to come with."
What follows is drawn from a document recovered in 1979 by investigative journalist Dora Ainsley during her research into Western Meridian land holdings. The document was a personal memorandum, handwritten by Clifford Orrin Vass, dated March 1958, addressed to no one. It was found inside a false panel in the wall of his Carson City office, behind a framed photograph of the Nevada desert. Ainsley described it in her unpublished notes as the most calm and therefore most terrifying thing she had ever read. It is reproduced here as closely as the available record allows. What you call negligence, I call arithmetic. I want to be precise about this, because precision is the only honest currency available to a man in my position, and I have always believed in honesty between a man and his own reflection, even when no other honesty is possible or advisable. The arithmetic is this: there is material that exists. It cannot be unmade. It cannot be wished away or prayed away or legislated into a different category of reality. It is what it is, and it will be what it is for longer than any of the men who created it will be alive to manage its consequences. Someone must decide where it goes. Someone must decide what the acceptable parameters of its placement are. Someone must perform this function, and that someone must be capable of performing it without the interference of sentiment, which is another word for the inability to accept that some problems do not have solutions that leave everyone whole. I have always been capable of this. I recognized it in myself at 17, and I have cultivated it deliberately ever since, the way you cultivate any professional asset. The Pruitt family. I will address the Pruitt family directly, because I find that the things one refuses to address directly have a tendency to expand in the dark. Walter Pruitt was a man who made a series of choices that led him to a piece of land that I had designated for a specific purpose. His choice to bring his family to that land was his own. I did not invite him. I did not advertise. The transaction that placed him there passed through 3 intermediaries precisely so that Western Meridian's name would not appear in the chain of title, precisely so that this kind of complication would not arise. The intermediaries failed. That failure had consequences. I managed those consequences within the parameters available to me. What I will not accept, what I find intellectually dishonest in the way that sentimentality is always intellectually dishonest, is the suggestion that I am responsible for Walter Pruitt's choices. I am responsible for the material. I am responsible for its placement and its containment, and the integrity of the operational security surrounding it. I am not responsible for the decisions of a man who chose to dig a well without first conducting any assessment of the land he was digging in. A man who chose to remain on a piece of property for 2.5 years while his family's health declined, filing letters to a state office rather than simply leaving. I have always found this detail the most confounding aspect of the Pruitt situation. He knew something was wrong. He documented it with considerable thoroughness. He chose to stay. I have turned this fact over in my mind many times across many years, and I keep arriving at the same conclusion, which is that Walter Pruitt wanted to be right, more than he wanted to be safe. He wanted a record. He wanted the thing that I was very carefully not giving him, which was acknowledgement. He stayed on that land because leaving would have meant accepting that no one was coming. I understand this impulse. I simply cannot afford to share it. The monitoring was necessary. I want to be plain about this. The soil sampling conducted at the Caldwell property between 1954 and 1957 was not cruelty. It was science. The dispersal data collected during the Pruitt occupation period is some of the most precise long-term contamination migration data ever assembled for a Class 4 desert burial site. That data has informed containment protocols used at 11 subsequent sites across 4 states. The men and women who will not be sickened because of what we learned at Caldwell Flats will never know to be grateful. I have made my peace with this asymmetry. A man in my position must make his peace with many asymmetries. There is one thing I will say that I have said to no one. One thing that lives in the part of me I keep separate from the arithmetic. Claire Pruitt was 5 years old in the last photograph taken of her, which I have seen because I reviewed all materials related to the Caldwell operation, and the photograph was among them. She is standing in front of the house. She is smiling.
She has a ribbon in her hair. I looked at that photograph for longer than was operationally necessary. I am aware of what that means, and I am aware of what it does not change. I have placed this awareness in the same compartment where I keep everything else that cannot be used and cannot be discarded, and must simply be carried. It is a large compartment. It has been accumulating contents for 30 years. I expect it will continue to do so until I no longer require it. I am not asking for understanding. I am not asking for anything. I am making a record, for no one, in a wall, because I find that honesty in private is the last luxury available to men who have traded all other kinds away. The arithmetic was correct. The arithmetic is always correct. The ground holds what is placed in it, and the ground does not judge, and neither, in the end, do I. Clifford Orrin Vass, Carson City, Nevada, March 1958.
Ruth Cannon was in the blue government sedan for 47 minutes before it stopped, and she used every one of those 47 minutes with the same methodical precision she brought to soil sampling and document analysis and every other problem that presented itself to her as something to be solved rather than something to be endured. There were two men in the sedan. The driver, who had not spoken since identifying himself outside the house, was a young man in a brown suit, whose nervous energy Ruth classed immediately as junior, someone performing authority he had been recently assigned, rather than someone who had inhabited it long enough to stop performing. The man in the passenger seat was different. He was perhaps 60, with the specific physical stillness of someone who has spent decades in rooms where stillness is a form of dominance. He had introduced himself as Mr. Ardell, which Ruth was certain was not his name, and which he had offered with the casual insolence of a man who knows that the person he is speaking to cannot compel him to do otherwise. Mr. Ardell asked her, in a voice of absolute conversational pleasantness, what she was doing in Caldwell Flats. She told him she was conducting a private geological survey for a land investment client. He asked for the client's name. She gave him a name she invented on the spot, a Reno attorney named Gerald Foss, and watched Mr. Ardell's face for the half-second reaction that would tell her whether Gerald Foss existed in his actual knowledge, which would mean she had accidentally named a real person, or whether his expression registered only the smoothness of someone logging a lie for later use. It registered the liar. She breathed. He asked about her equipment. She described it in accurate technical terms, understanding that technical accuracy creates an impression of transparency that strategic omission cannot. He asked whether she had collected any samples. She said yes, standard geological grid samples, as would be expected for a survey of this type. He asked whether she had found anything of interest. She said, "I found what appears to be elevated mineral content in the eastern sectors, consistent with historical mining activity in the area, which is precisely what you would expect from land that hosted a silver operation in the 1880s, and which I intend to document fully for my client." She said this with the even, slightly bored voice of a professional describing routine findings, and she watched Mr. Ardell's face perform the calculation that faces a cost of excavating. He decided, she could see him decide, that she was manageable, that she was a black woman geologist in 1962 operating without institutional backing, and that whatever she had found or suspected could be addressed through the mechanisms that had always addressed such things, through the quiet application of professional and economic pressure, through the suggestion that her findings were preliminary and her methodology questionable, through the reminder, delivered pleasantly and without explicit threat, that the Federal Land Administration had a strong interest in ensuring that private surveys in sensitive areas were conducted through appropriate channels. He delivered all of this during the 47 minutes, and Ruth listened to it with complete attention and agreed with enough of it to be convincing, and deflected the rest with the professional manner of someone who takes the point, and will certainly be in touch about the appropriate channels. And when the sedan stopped in front of the Dubois house and Mr. Ardell said she was free to go, and that he hoped their conversation had been clarifying, she said that it had been very clarifying indeed, and she got out of the vehicle and walked to the house without looking back, and she heard the sedan reverse and pull away and did not turn around until the sound of its engine had been replaced entirely by the sound of the desert wind. She lifted the kitchen hatch, and Harlan came up out of the crawlspace with the camera still against his chest, blinking in the kitchen light, and she looked at him and said, "We have until tomorrow morning." He said, "How certain are you?" She said, "Certain enough that we leave tonight." He said, "The samples under the truck?" She said, "Already in the house." He said, "The tin in Sector 1? She said, "Leave it. It is the backup."
If everything else is taken, it stays in the ground until someone who knows where to look comes for it. He looked at her. She said, I know where it is. He said, so do I. She said, then between us it cannot be permanently lost. He nodded once, and they began. The confrontation with the second vehicle, the black Ford with no plates, came at 11 o'clock that night, 2 hours before they had planned to leave. The Ford was parked across the access road, its lights off, its engine cold. There was one man inside, and he was not as patient as Mr. Ardell and not as nervous as the driver. He was a man whose professional category Ruth did not have a precise word for, but whose purpose was entirely legible. He was the version of Norman Teague that Clifford Vass would have sent if he were still alive to send anyone. He got out of the Ford when Ruth's truck headlights hit him, and he stood in the road with a steadiness that communicated that he was not going to move and that he was not concerned about whether they wanted him to. Harlan was driving. Ruth was in the passenger seat with the foam sample case on her lap and the metal box on the floor at her feet, and the field notebooks in her jacket, one against each side of her body. Harlan looked at the man in the road for a moment. Then he said, hold on, and he drove the truck off the road to the left, through the sage and the hardpan and the rocks that banged against the undercarriage with a sound like gunshots, the headlights sweeping wild arcs across the desert, and when he brought the truck back onto the county road 30 yards past the Ford, he was driving at a speed that the county road was not designed for, and neither of them said anything until the lights of the Ford had vanished in the mirrors, and the highway appeared ahead of them like a sentence finally reaching its period.
They were 40 miles north of Caldwell Flats, on the highway toward Winnemucca, when Harlan said, I have to go back. Ruth looked at him. He said, the tin in Sector 1 is the only physical evidence that places Vass at the site on November 14th. Without it, everything we have is documented by us, collected by us, interpreted by us. A good lawyer makes that about our credibility. We are a desperate man who bought contaminated land, and a black female geologist without institutional affiliation. He said this without self-pity, with the same flatness he used for things that were simply true. He said, the tin has the photograph of the Pruitt family. It has Walter Pruitt's 7th letter. It has a soil sample from Sector 9 taken on the morning of November 14th, before Vass arrived. And it has the partial plate number from the green truck, logged in my handwriting with a date and time, which connects the monitoring operation to the property in the weeks before Vass came. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, if you go back, they may be watching the road. He said, I know. She said, if they find you on that property with no documentation in your possession, with Norman Teague's body somewhere on that land. She stopped. He said, I know. She said, Harlan. He said, I know what I'm asking. I'm not asking you to come. I'm asking you to take what we have to your sister's house and wait. If I'm not in Winnemucca by morning, you take everything to Dora Ainsley at the Nevada State Journal. Don't go to the Health Division. Don't go to federal channels. Go directly to Ainsley. Do you know her? Ruth said, I know of her. He said, that will have to be enough. Ruth looked at the highway ahead of them, and then at Harlan's profile in the dark of the truck cab, and she understood that this was not a moment that permitted argument. Not because Harlan was unreachable, but because he was entirely right, and they both knew it, and the only honest thing available to either of them was to acknowledge that. She said, the tin is 8 inches down, northwest corner of Sector 1, 3 paces from the first grid stake. He said, I remember. She said, be careful of the eastern sectors in the dark. He said, I know where the eastern sectors are. She said, Harlan. He said, Ruth. She reached into her jacket and gave him one of the field notebooks, the one with the raw meter readings, the chain of custody documentation, the verbatim record of what Norman Teague had told her. She said, if you are going back there, you take this. If something happens to you, I want this found with you. I want your name on the record alongside mine. He looked at the notebook for a moment and then put it inside his jacket. He turned the truck around on the empty highway, and she got out with the sample case and the metal box and stood on the shoulder of the road and watched his taillights moving south until the desert dark took them. She stood there for a long time. The stars over Nevada in November 1962 were enormous and indifferent. She was 41 years old, standing on a highway shoulder in the dark, with evidence of a federal crime in a foam fishing tackle box, and she had made in the past 10 days decisions that she would spend the rest of her life qualifying and defending and being unable to fully forgive herself for, and none of that changed what was necessary, and what was necessary was to keep moving.
She started walking north toward the lights of Winnemucca, and she did not look back again.
Harlan Dubois arrived back at Winnemucca at 6:43 in the morning of November 17th, 1962, driving with both hands on the wheel and the field notebook in his jacket and the tin from Sector 1 on the passenger seat. He had a cut along his left forearm from the sage he had pushed through in the dark, moving in a wide circle around the eastern sectors, and his boots were caked with pale Nevada soil that he would find himself staring at later in ways he could not explain. He knocked on the door of Ruth's sister Vera's house on Malarkey Street, and Ruth opened the door before the second knock and looked at the tin in his hand, and then at his face, and said nothing for a moment. Then she stood aside and let him in. They sat at Vera's kitchen table, a different kitchen table, smaller, warmer, with the smell of coffee that Vera had put on without being asked, and they looked at what they had. 2 field notebooks, 1 foam sample case containing 17 sealed and labeled soil samples, 1 metal box containing the Pruitt letters, the Pruitt photograph, the partial plate number log, and the 3 partial government documents, 1 tin containing the photograph, the 7th letter, and the November 14th sample from Sector 9. It was, Ruth said quietly, enough. Not everything. Not the kind of everything that makes prosecution inevitable, but enough that a determined journalist with the right instincts would know what questions to ask and where to look, and enough that the answers to those questions, once publicly asked, could not be quietly reclassified because they would already be in print. They agreed on 3 things at Vera's kitchen table. They would not speak to each other by telephone. They would not put each other's names in any document that also contained the word Caldwell, and they would not, under any circumstances, return to Caldwell Flats. The cover story, for Eleanor, for the children, for the neighbors and co-workers, and anyone else who would eventually ask why the Dubois family had left their property so abruptly, was that the house had proven structurally unsound and the land unsuitable for the agricultural use they had intended. It was a story with the great advantage of being partially true. They shook hands at Vera's front door in the gray November morning, and Harlan walked to his truck, and Ruth watched him go, and neither of them said anything that would have been adequate to what had happened, because nothing adequate existed. By the spring of 1963, the Dubois family had settled in Reno, in a rented house on the east side of the city that was smaller than what Harlan had dreamed of and larger than what he had feared they would end up with. Eleanor never asked directly about Caldwell Flats. She asked around it, the way you walk around a structure you are not certain will hold your weight. And Harlan answered the questions she actually asked with a precision that was technically honest and morally evasive, and which Eleanor, who was not a woman who missed things, accepted with a quietness that told him she had decided that some doors were better left with their handles untried. Marin recovered slowly. By 1964 she was speaking again, in full sentences, though she would have, for the rest of her childhood, an aversion to soil, to gardens, to digging, to the smell of earth turned over, that no one in the family discussed directly, and that required no discussion, because everyone understood it in the wordless way that families understand the things that have marked them. By 1966, Harlan had found work as a structural inspector for a Reno construction firm, a position that suited his observational precision and that paid well enough that the rented house became a purchased house, and the purchased house became, gradually, a life that resembled from the outside the life he had been trying to build when he turned onto the Caldwell Flats access road. He never spoke about what had happened to Norman Teague. He never spoke about what had happened to Clifford Vass. He kept the field notebook Ruth had pressed into his jacket inside a locked metal box in the back of his workshop, and on certain evenings, when the light was a particular quality of gray and the wind was coming from the south, He would go into the workshop and not come out for a while, and Eleanor would find some reason to keep the children indoors, and no one said anything about it. Ruth Cannon took the documentation to Dora Ainsley at the Nevada State Journal in December of 1962. Ainsley listened to everything and examined everything, and then sat quietly for a long time and said, "I cannot publish this yet." Ruth said, "I know." Ainsley said, "I can start pulling the thread." Ruth said, "Pull carefully." By 1965, Ruth had returned to independent geological consulting, her reputation rebuilt by the careful distance of time and the complete absence of any official action against her, which told her that the men who had sent Mr. Ardell had concluded she was manageable and had moved on to other concerns. She was fine with being underestimated. She had always been fine with being underestimated. It was, she had told her father once when she was young, the only reliable advantage available to her, and she intended to use it for as long as it held. In 1971, a partial Freedom of Information request filed by a University of Nevada environmental science graduate student named Paul Okafor produced a heavily redacted document from the Atomic Energy Commission's contractor management files. The document referenced in its unredacted portions a Class 4 disposal operation in Humboldt County, Nevada, completed between 1953 and 1957, administered through a private landholding company whose name had been blacked out. The document noted that a post-operational monitoring protocol had been conducted at the site through 1957, and that the protocol had been formally closed in November of that year. Paul Okafor included this document as a footnote in his thesis on radiological land contamination in the American West. His thesis advisor suggested he remove the footnote on the grounds that the sourcing was insufficient. He removed it. His thesis was approved. In 1979, Dora Ainsley, by then a senior investigative reporter with 17 years of thread pulling behind her, published a 3-part series in the Nevada State Journal titled The Quiet Land, which documented the history of private waste disposal contracts in the Nevada desert between 1950 and 1965. The series named Western Meridian Land Holdings. It named Clifford Orrin Vass, describing him as a former AEC contractor whose current whereabouts were unknown. It referenced the Caldwell Flats area in the context of suspected Class 4 disposal activity, and noted that the land records for the relevant parcels contained a gap in the chain of title between 1957 and 1962 that the Humboldt County Recorder's Office was unable to explain. The series won a Regional Journalism Award. It was not picked up by any national publication. Ainsley told Ruth Cannon in a phone call after the series ran that she had received 2 calls from men who did not leave their names, and that her editor had received a visit from a Federal Land Administration representative who had described the series as containing significant factual inaccuracies without specifying what they were. Ainsley said she was going to keep going. She retired in 1984 without publishing anything further on the subject. She told a colleague on her last day at the paper that she had found the wall and it was solid, and that she was tired, and that she hoped someone younger had better tools. She died in 1991. Her personal files, 17 boxes of research material accumulated over 30 years of investigative journalism, were donated to the University of Nevada Library. A 2003 inventory of the collection noted that boxes 11 through 14, described in her own index as Nevada Land Contamination Research 1962 to 1984, were missing. The library has no record of their removal. The chain of custody documentation for the donation lists all 17 boxes as received. Boxes 11 through 14 have not been located. There is one fact about Caldwell Flats that has never been adequately explained, even by the partial records that exist. In 1988, a Nevada State environmental survey conducted as part of a federal Superfund site assessment program tested the soil at the former Caldwell Flats location. The survey found elevated radiological readings in the eastern sectors of the site, consistent with what Ruth Cannon's field meter had recorded in November of 1962. It found the concrete cap of the old mine shaft still in place, still intact. It found the subsidence depression in Sector 9, by then 26 years old, overgrown with sage and unremarkable in appearance. What the survey did not find, what its own report noted as anomalous and left formally unexplained, was any trace of the burial drums. The ground-penetrating radar used during the survey showed no metallic objects at any depth in any one of the 3 suspected burial locations. The soil chemistry confirmed that something had been there. The radar confirmed that whatever it was gone. No removal operation was ever filed with the AEC, the EPA, or any state environmental authority. No contractor records for a retrieval operation at the Caldwell Flat site exist in any archive that has been made accessible. Whatever Clifford Vass buried in the ground beneath the main street of Caldwell Flats was removed by someone at some point, with a thoroughness that left no paper trail and no witness. Where it went has never been established.
What Caldwell Flats tells us about human nature is something most of us already know and spend considerable energy not thinking about. It tells us that cruelty at scale does not require monsters. It requires administrators. It requires men like Clifford Vass, who was not incapable of recognizing Claire Pruitt's ribbon in a photograph, and who chose, deliberately and repeatedly, to place that recognition in a compartment and close the lid, because the alternative was to stop being useful to the system that gave his life its shape and purpose. The banality of what happened in the Nevada desert between 1953 and 1962 is not a detail that softens the horror. It is the horror. It is the specific species of horror that industrial civilization has proven most adept at producing and least willing to examine. The horror that has a budget line and a filing system and a chain of approved signatures, and men who go home to their families at night without nightmares because they have learned to call what they do arithmetic. What it means for us today is less comfortable still. The machinery that made Caldwell Flats possible, the combination of government secrecy, corporate insulation, geographic isolation, and the systematic economic desperation that makes people willing to ask fewer questions than they should about land that costs less than it ought to, did not dismantle itself when the Cold War ended. It adapted. It found new materials and new locations and new categories of people whose objections could be absorbed without consequence. The names of the places change. The structure of the silence does not. Every generation produces its Caldwell Flats, and every generation produces the same distribution of people in response to it. The administrators who do the arithmetic, the Teagues who carry out what the arithmetic requires, the Walter Pruitts who write letters to offices that are not listening, and the very rare Ruth Cannons who spend years pulling a thread in the knowledge that the wall at the end of it is solid and are unwilling to stop anyway. The question worth asking is not which of these people you would be. The question worth asking is which of them you already are. The unanswered question that Caldwell Flats leaves behind, the one that I find myself returning to in the way you return to something that will not resolve, is about Harlan Dubois specifically and what his story actually means. He was not innocent. He knew the land was wrong and he brought his children to it anyway, because desperation is its own species of moral compromise, one that the comfortable have always found easy to condemn and the desperate have always found impossible to avoid. He then did something to address what he had done, imperfectly, at considerable cost, with methods that crossed lines that do not uncross. He spent the rest of his life, as far as any record shows, living quietly in Reno and inspecting buildings for structural soundness with his water-glass eyes, and not talking about Nevada, and going into his workshop on certain gray evenings and not coming out for a while. The question is whether that is a story about guilt or atonement, or simply about survival. The question is whether there is a version of Harlan Dubois' choices that would have produced a better outcome, and whether that version was actually available to a man in his position in 1962, or whether it only appears available from a distance of 60 years and a position of security that Harlan Dubois never had. I do not have an answer to this. I am not certain an answer exists. I think that uncertainty is the most honest thing this story leaves us with, and I think honest uncertainty, unflinching and unresolved, is the closest thing to justice that most of these stories ever get.
If this story stayed with you, if it made you think, made you uncomfortable, or made you angry, then it did its job. Because Caldwell Flats is a fictional story, built from a very real architecture. The contaminated lands were real. The classified disposal contracts were real. The families who moved onto ground that powerful men had quietly decided was acceptable to sacrifice, they were real. The letters that went unanswered were real. Only the names have been changed, and not as many of them as you might hope. Drop a comment below with this question. If you had been Harlan Dubois, if you had known something was wrong before you signed the papers, and you signed them anyway because the alternative was another year of nothing, what would you have done differently? And be honest. Comfortable answers are easy. Honest ones are harder. If you found this channel for the first time today, subscribe now, because every story we tell here is one they tried to bury. We bring them back. Next week, we cover the case of the Anner Creek Sanitarium, 1907, the institution that cured nobody, billed everyone, and whose patient records, when finally unsealed in 1963, described procedures that the medical board called unprecedented, and that 3 forensic historians have since called something else entirely. We'll see you in the dark.